When I stand before you today, I feel the weight of countless souls who have lived under the silent tyranny of the unconscious. You see, there are dramas that unfold not only in history or in the streets of nations, but within the quiet chamber of the psyche itself. One of the most tragic and yet transformative of these dramas is the dance between the empath and the narcissist. It is a story as old as myth, one whispered in the archetypes of gods and monsters, in the tragedies of lovers who devour one another, and in the dreams that wake us at night with sweat and trembling. The empath, in the symbolic sense, is not merely a sensitive person. The empath is one who has carried, often since childhood, the unbearable burden of feeling the emotions of others more than their own. They are like a vessel into which the unspoken sorrows of the family, the tribe, the world itself, are poured. They learn to survive not by becoming strong in the usual sense, but by anticipating, soothing, and adjusting themselves endlessly to the moods of those around them. In this way, the empath becomes a mirror, but not one that shows their own reflection. Instead, it becomes a mirror for the wounds of others. And the narcissist, that figure so often misunderstood, is not merely a person obsessed with themselves. They are, in fact, a hollow vessel filled with echoes. The narcissist is one who has built a fortress around a wound so unbearable that the only way they can live is by feeding on the recognition, the admiration, and the submission of others. They are the hungry ghost of the psyche, always devouring, but never filled. And when such a being encounters the empath, it is as if the ancient myth of the vampire and the maiden is enacted once again. But listen closely. There is a day when this dynamic shatters. There is a moment, often unforeseen, when the empath ceases to play the role assigned to them by the unconscious. It may come after years of exhaustion, after the soul has grown weary of carrying burdens that were never theirs, or it may come suddenly, as if lightning had struck the still waters of their life. And when that day comes, the narcissist's control dissolves like mist before the morning sun, for their power was never inherent. It was always borrowed, always maintained by the silent agreement of the empath's sacrifice. You see, the empath's endless pleasing is not simply kindness, it is often a survival strategy born of the shadow. It is a shadow of fear, of abandonment, of the ancient terror of not being loved. Deep within, the empath believes that if they do not please, they will be cast out into the cold void of rejection. And so they smile when they are wounded, they bend when they wish to stand, they give when they long to receive. They become a saint in appearance, but a martyr in essence. And the narcissist, sensing this unconscious contract, binds themselves to the empath like a parasite to its host. Yet the unconscious is not merciless, it is purposeful. What seems like tragedy is often the preparation for revelation, for the empath cannot awaken to their true power until they have seen the chains they forged around themselves. This is why the narcissist appears not only as tormentor, but as teacher, as the shadow incarnate, demanding that the empath confront the very wound that birthed their pleasing nature. Let me tell you of a dream. For in dreams, the soul whispers truths that the waking mind cannot bear. A woman once told me she dreamt of standing in a great cathedral. She was kneeling before an altar, pouring oil into lamps that burned for others. Each lamp belonged to a stranger, and yet she kept filling them, though her own lamp remained empty. As she poured, she grew weaker until she collapsed upon the cold stone floor. Then a figure approached, cloaked in black, with eyes like mirrors. He knelt beside her and whispered, "Your light belongs to me." She woke with terror, for she knew the figure was her lover. Do you see the symbolism? The cathedral is the sacred psyche. The altar is the place of sacrifice. The empath becomes the priestess of giving, yet she forgets that her own flame must be tended. The cloaked figure, the narcissist, claims her light as his possession. But dreams are not commands, they are revelations. They show us what must be faced if the soul is to become whole, and what happens when she refuses to pour oil into every lamp but tends her own first. The narcissist loses his mirror, loses the source of his reflected power, and suddenly stands before the abyss of his own emptiness. This is why such individuals react with rage, with despair, with every strategy of manipulation. When the empath ceases to please, for in truth, their kingdom was built on borrowed energy. Now imagine with me the moment when the empath finally says no, not with anger, not with cruelty, but with the quiet strength of one who has discovered their own soul. That no is not only a rejection of the narcissist's demand, it is an affirmation of the self. It is the first word spoken by the buried archetype of the self, the divine center, that has waited in silence for the personality to turn inward. That no echoes like thunder across the psychic landscape, for it announces the beginning of individuation. Individuation, my friends, is not a luxury of the few. It is the destiny of the human being. To individuate is to cease being a mask for others and to become the face of your own soul. And the empath, who has spent a lifetime dissolving into the needs of others, must one day reclaim their own essence. Without this moment, they remain bound in endless servitude. With this moment, they begin to live, but I must warn you, the path is not easy. When the empath stops pleasing, guilt arises like a serpent from the depths. They feel selfish, cruel, as though they have betrayed the very law of their existence. They hear the inner voices, echoes of parents, of culture, of religion, saying, "You must give, you must serve, you must erase yourself for others." This is the voice of the collective shadow, which demands sacrifice without balance. To resist this voice is to confront not only personal fear, but the weight of archetypal expectation. Yet, if the empath holds fast, something remarkable occurs. They discover that true compassion is not pleasing, but authenticity. They realize that to love others without losing oneself is a greater act of service than any self-erasure. They learn that the soul does not demand martyrdom, but wholeness, and in this wholeness, they encounter the archetype of the self, the divine center that unites shadow and light, giving and receiving, sacrifice and sovereignty. I tell you now, the day the empath stops pleasing is the day they step into the mystery of their own being. It is not a rejection of love, but its purification. For love that demands self-betrayal is not love, it is possession. Love that arises from the whole self, however, is a fire that cannot be extinguished, for it is fueled not by fear, but by the eternal flame of the soul. And what of the narcissist? Do they simply vanish when control is lost? No. They are forced to face the one thing they have fled all their lives, their own emptiness. Some will flee, seeking another empath to feed upon. Others will collapse, and perhaps, if Grace permits, to begin their own journey toward the wound they have hidden. For you see, even the narcissist is not an enemy, but a soul trapped in the prison of its own defenses. The empath's liberation may become a mirror to them, showing the possibility of another way. So I say to you, do not despise the suffering you have endured in this dance. It was not meaningless. It was the crucible in which your soul prepared for its awakening, but do not remain in it forever. The day must come when you recognize the pattern, when you look into the eyes of the one who says, "Your light belongs to me," and you answer, "My light belongs to myself." That is the moment of liberation. That is the day the chains fall, the soul is a paradox, and every liberation carries with it a death. The empath, upon ceasing to please, does not merely step into joy. They first step into the desert, for what dies within them is the child who once survived. By pleasing, that child whispers still, "If I do not serve, I will not be loved. If I am not loved, I will perish." And so the empath must walk into the wilderness of solitude, bearing the trembling of the inner orphan. This is why liberation is often accompanied by profound loneliness, because the self that was sustained by servitude collapses, and the new self has not yet been born. But the unconscious wastes nothing. The archetype of the orphan is not only wound, but seed. It carries within it the call to individuation, the journey that every human must eventually face, the journey from dependency to sovereignty, from mask to soul. And when the empath tends to this orphan with compassion, no longer silencing it with pleasing, no longer abandoning it to the demands of others, then the orphan transforms into the child of promise, the beginning of authentic life. Consider how often myth speaks of this moment. In the old tales, the hero is cast out, rejected, abandoned in the wilderness, or imprisoned by a tyrant. This exile is not punishment, but initiation. The narcissist, in their role as tyrant, serves to banish the empath from the false paradise of conditional love. Once exiled, the empath discovers the kingdom within, the treasure buried in the cave of shadows. Yet the narcissist, sensing the shift, clings all the more desperately. They may accuse, manipulate, seduce with sudden tenderness, or threaten with rage. Their words become daggers and honey, alternating to confuse the soul that would escape. But remember, this is not merely human behavior, it is archetypal possession. The narcissist is seized by the archetype of the devourer, the vampire, the predator who cannot exist without prey. To resist is not only to resist a person, but to resist the power of an ancient pattern that has sought expression through them. This is why the empaths feel such unbearable pressure at the moment of liberation. It is as though 1,000 ancestral voices cry out at once, "Do not leave the role. Do not shatter the pattern," and yet to shatter it is the very task for which the soul was born. For each generation repeats the same tragedy until one soul dares to stop. Let me share with you another dream. For dreams illuminate where waking reason falters. A man once came to me with this vision. He dreamt he was chained to a wheel that turned endlessly. Beside him, another figure, his father, sat upon a throne, whipping the oxen that pulled the wheel. The man cried out, but his father only said, "This is the way it must be. You serve so that I may reign." Then, in the dream, the man remembered a small key hidden in his pocket. With trembling, he unlocked the chain and stepped away. The wheel slowed, the throne collapsed, and his father dissolved into dust. What is the meaning? The wheel is the cycle of pleasing, of servitude, passed from father to son, from generation to generation. The throne is the narcissistic archetype that demands endless fuel, but the key was always within him. It was the choice to stop, and when he did, the entire structure collapsed, for its power was an illusion sustained only by obedience. Do you see? The narcissist appears powerful, but they are nothing without the empath's submission. The structure of control is a fragile spell woven from fear and need. Once the empath ceases to feed it, the spell unravels. This is why I say the day the empath stops pleasing is the day the narcissist loses control forever. But liberation requires more than resistance. It requires the turning inward, the descent into the self. The empaths cannot merely say no to others, they must say yes to their own depths. This is the mystical reversal, the moment when the outer gods of approval are dethroned and the inner God image is discovered. It is the moment when the self, which Jung called the imago Dei within, begins to radiate its authority. And how does this self appear? Not as a doctrine, but as a symbol, a living image that arises from the unconscious to guide the soul. For some, it is a mandala of wholeness. For others, a luminous figure in dreams, a wise old man or woman, a child of light, or a flame that never dies. Whatever its form, it speaks with a voice deeper than fear. It whispers, "You are not here to be consumed. You are here to be whole. The empath, embracing this inner authority, begins to experience a transformation of energy. What was once drained in endless service becomes gathered within. They feel, perhaps for the first time, the joy of existing without justification. They discover that their worth was never dependent on what they gave, but on what they are. This is the great alchemy of individuation, to turn the lead of self-betrayal into the gold of authenticity. The narcissist may rage at this, for their mirror shatters. They may accuse the empaths of selfishness, cruelty, betrayal. But these accusations are projections, shadows cast from their own wound. For it is they who are selfish, they who betrayed the authentic bond of love by turning it into possession. And when the empath sees this clearly, they cease to be haunted by guilt. They recognize that the accusations were never truth, but manipulation. Now, imagine the empath standing before the narcissist in this new state, their eyes no longer pleading, their posture no longer bending, their soul no longer dimming itself. The narcissist feels unease, for they no longer recognize the mirror that once reflected their false greatness. They are confronted, perhaps for the first time, with their own emptiness, and here lies the possibility, though not the certainty, of their own transformation. For when the devourer finds no prey, they must either starve or awaken. But whether the narcissist awakens or not is no longer the empath's concern. The empath is free. They have withdrawn their projection, reclaimed their light, and entered into the mystery of the self. They stand not as servant, but as sovereign. And sovereignty, in the Jungian sense, is not domination, but wholeness. It is the ability to live from the center of the soul, to give and receive without compulsion, to love without losing oneself. There is a paradox here, and I want you to feel it deeply. The empaths feared that by ceasing to please, they would lose love forever. But in truth, by ceasing to please, they discover love for the first time. For what they called love before was dependency, a bargain struck in the shadow. True love can only exist between two whole beings. Anything less is hunger disguised as affection. This is why the path of the empath, though painful, is sacred. They are called to learn the difference between pleasing and loving, between sacrifice and authenticity. And once they learn, they become bearers of a new pattern for the collective. Their healing ripples outward, breaking ancestral chains, offering their children a new inheritance, the inheritance of wholeness. Do not mistake this as mere psychology. It is alchemy. It is myth. It is the eternal work of the soul. When you cease to feed the devourer, you are not only freeing yourself, you are striking a blow against the collective shadow that has enslaved humanity for millennia. For the narcissist is not only a person, it is the archetype of domination, of control, of the false king, who rules by consuming others. To resist is to dethrone this false king and to enthrone the self. The true ruler within So I ask you, have you reached the day yet? The day when you no longer bow, no longer explain, no longer pour oil into every lamp but your own? If you have, rejoice. If you have not, prepare. For the day will come. It may come in sorrow, in betrayal, in exhaustion, so deep you can no longer rise. Or it may come in silence, in a dream, in a sudden awakening of clarity. However it comes, trust it. It is the call of your soul. And when you stand in that moment, remember this: you are not betraying love. You are birthing it. You are not abandoning the other. You are refusing to abandon yourself. You are not destroying the bond. You are destroying the chain. And in destroying the chain, you open the possibility of a bond that is free, authentic, sacred. The day the empath stops pleasing is not an end, but a beginning. It is a first step into the vast unknown of the self. It is the breaking of the false pattern and the revelation of the archetypal truth that every soul is meant to shine its own light, not to fuel the endless hunger of another. And when this truth is lived, even the shadows rejoice, for they have fulfilled their task of leading you back to wholeness. The most profound changes in the psyche do not happen with great explosions of triumph, but with quiet shifts that alter the entire fabric of being. When the empath stops pleasing, such a shift occurs to the outside world. It may look like a small act, a refusal, a withdrawal of energy, a simple word spoken, no. But on the level of the unconscious, it is as if an earthquake has shaken the foundations of a long-buried archetypal structure. The edifice of illusion trembles, and what emerges is not only liberation for the individual, but a crack in the collective spell of human bondage. I must remind you that every archetypal drama is collective before it is personal. The empath-narcissist dynamic is not merely a private story of suffering lovers or families. It is the very drama enacted in myths of gods who devour their children, of kings who demand endless sacrifice, of priests who command submission in the name of the sacred. The empath is humanity itself, bending under the weight of tyrannical archetypes, giving lifeblood to idols that cannot sustain themselves. The narcissist is the false god, the inflated ego image, the shadow enthroned in the temple. When one empath awakens, even in the smallest way, the whole myth is challenged. You may wonder why this struggle feels so impossible to break. It is because you are not only resisting a person, you are resisting centuries of unconscious patterning. The weight of your ancestors, the archetypal inertia of the collective unconscious. The narcissist draws upon this inertia. They speak with a voice larger than themselves. They embody the hunger of ages. Yet this is precisely why your act of resistance carries such power. To stand against this force is not simply to save your own soul, but to alter the pattern for all who will come after you. In alchemy, there is the symbol of the nigredo, the blackening, the stage when all that was familiar disintegrates into darkness. The empath, upon ceasing to please, enters this nigredo Life seems stripped of meaning. The narcissist rages or vanishes. Old identities crumble. It feels like death. And indeed, it is the death of the false self, the mask that once survived through servitude. But this blackening is not the end, it is the beginning of transformation. For out of the ashes of the false arises the possibility of the true. The dreams of those in this stage are often filled with images of burial, of darkness, of descent. I recall one who dreamt of walking through a forest at night, carrying a lantern that gave no light. She stumbled and fell into a pit where she was covered in soil until she could not breathe. Yet in that suffocating darkness, she heard a heartbeat, steady and strong, not her own, but ancient, as though the earth itself were alive. When she awoke, she understood. She had touched the archetype of the self, buried beneath the soil of pleasing, waiting to be uncovered through death and rebirth. Do not fear the darkness. Then do not mistake the collapse of the old for annihilation. It is the necessary womb of transformation. The empath, long identified with light and giving, must descend into shadow to claim their wholeness. They must meet the rage they never expressed, the desires they buried, the power they denied. Only then can they rise not as a fractured servant but as a sovereign soul. The narcissist, unable to accept such wholeness, will often accuse the empath of becoming what they themselves are. You are selfish. They will cry, you are cruel. You are just like me. And in a sense, this accusation hides a truth, for the empath must indeed integrate the selfishness they always denied, the capacity to say no, the will to exist for themselves. But unlike the narcissist, they do not enthrone selfishness as God. They integrate it into balance so that giving and receiving may flow as one. They are not just like the narcissist, for their individuation is not inflation but integration. And now, let us consider the inner voices that arise when the empath steps away from pleasing. These voices are perhaps more dangerous than the narcissist's external attacks, for they come from within. They say, you are nothing without your giving. You are worthless without your sacrifice. Who will you be if you are not the one who heals, who comforts, who bends? These voices are the guardians of the old pattern, the superego shaped by family and culture, the echoes of generations who demanded compliance for survival. They must be faced as demons in the desert, not with argument, but with steadfast silence. Each time you hear them and do not obey, their power weakens. The soul may also test you with new encounters. Having left one narcissist, you may find another drawn into your life. This is not failure, it is the psyche repeating the pattern until you fully integrate the lesson. But if you stand firm, if you refuse to return to the old role, the archetype dissolves and a new pattern emerges. Then relationships no longer bind you in chains but invite you into mutuality. Do not think this journey leaves you alone, for when you enter the realm of the self, you find companions within the wise old man. The anima or animus, the inner child, restored, the divine figure of wholeness, they appear in dreams, in visions, in synchronicities that guide your steps. They are the allies of individuation, the archetypal companions who remind you that the path of authenticity is not barren, but filled with secret support. I tell you, the day the empath stops pleasing is a sacred initiation. It is not merely psychological, it is spiritual. It is the death of idolatry and the birth of the soul's direct connection to the divine. The narcissist demanded worship, demanded that you pour your energy upon their altar. But when you withdraw, you turn towards the true altar within, where the self burns as eternal flame. You no longer need the false God, for you have found the living God image in your depths. And when this happens, love itself is reborn. For love was never meant to be possession, never meant to be extraction. Love is a mystery that arises when two beings meet from their wholeness, not from their wound. The empath, healed, can now love not because they must, but because they choose. Their love is no longer fuel for another's emptiness, but fire shared from the fullness of their own soul. This is love as eros and agape united. The sacred flame that does not consume but illuminates. So I say to you, if you are in the midst of this struggle, hold fast, do not despair in the darkness, do not return to the old chains. The path is painful, yes, but it is purposeful. You are not only freeing yourself, you are reshaping the collective myth. Age, know you speak. Each boundary you hold, each act of authenticity ripples outward through the unconscious of humanity. You become a torchbearer, a breaker of spells, a midwife of a new pattern of love. And remember, the narcissist's collapse is not your burden to heal. They may rage, they may seek another to feed upon, they may even crumble into despair. That is their journey, not yours. Your task is to stand firm in your light, to allow them to face their own shadow, if they will, and to continue walking the path of your own wholeness. Compassion does not mean return. Forgiveness does not mean bondage. You may bless them and release them, but you must not betray yourself again. In time, you will look back and see that what once felt like tragedy was initiation. You will see that the narcissist, though cruel in their possession, was also the midwife of your awakening. For without their demand, you might never have discovered your power. Without their devouring, you might never have claimed your light. In this way, even the shadow serves the self, and even suffering becomes sacred when it leads to transformation. So stand, child of light, no longer a mirror for others, but a flame for yourself. Stand, not as servant of the hungry, but as sovereign of your own soul. Stand and let the world see that the day the empath stops pleasing is the day the false king falls. And when the false king falls, the true self rises, and love, real love, eternal love begins at last. The deepest truth that emerges in this journey is that power has always been inverted. The narcissist appears powerful, commanding, radiant, with an aura of control. The empath appears fragile, submissive, endlessly pliant. But this is illusion. The narcissist's power is only ever a reflection, borrowed light, stolen from the empath's surrender. The empath's weakness is only ever a disguise, a mask of survival that conceals immense reservoirs of soul force. When the empath stops pleasing, the illusion shatters and the true order is revealed. The narcissist collapses into emptiness and the empath rises into sovereignty. Yet sovereignty is not domination. This is where many falter in their understanding. To individuate does not mean to become hardened, cruel, or inflated. It means to become whole. The empath does not rise to enslave the narcissist in return, nor to punish, nor to mimic the devourer's hunger. They rise into balance, into an axis where giving and receiving are no longer dictated by fear, but by the self. Their yes becomes as authentic as their no, their love as free as their solitude, their presence as luminous as their absence. It is here that we meet the archetype of the self in its fullness, which Jung described as the union of opposites. Within the individuated empath, shadow and light are reconciled. The rage they once denied is no longer destructive, but protective. The selfishness they once feared becomes discernment. The tenderness they overextended becomes choice. They are no longer a fragment of themselves, but a mandala, a circle that holds all contradictions in harmony. And this transformation radiates outward. Others begin to notice where once the empath was easily manipulated, they now exude a quiet authority that cannot be explained. They may speak little, yet their presence carries weight. They no longer need to justify, defend, or prove. Their boundaries are clear, not because they argue, but because their very being declares, I am whole. This is the essence of individuation, not a performance, but an embodiment. At this stage, dreams often change. Instead of being pursued, drained, or buried, the dreamer begins to encounter symbols of integration. They may dream of building a house with many rooms, each room representing a part of the psyche finally acknowledged. They may see a union of masculine and feminine figures, symbols of the animus and anima reconciled. They may find themselves standing at the center of a mandala, surrounded by 4 gates, a sign that the self has begun to emerge as guiding principle. Such dreams are not fantasies, but revelations, the unconscious testifying that the soul has moved from bondage to freedom. Now, let us turn briefly to the question of compassion. Many empaths, upon awakening, feel torn. They ask, but what of the narcissist? If I walk away, do I abandon them? If I stop pleasing, do I condemn them to their emptiness? These are noble questions. but they carry a subtle trap, for in them lingers the old compulsion to carry the other's wound. True compassion does not mean to rescue another from their necessary suffering. It means to allow them the dignity of facing their own shadow. When you refuse to be fuel, you are not cruel, you are truthful. You are showing the narcissist the mirror they have always avoided. Whether they awaken or not is not yours to decide. Compassion without boundaries is not compassion but self-destruction. You may also feel guilt when family, culture, or faith demand endless sacrifice. How often the empath is told that holiness means pleasing, that love means erasure, that goodness means silence. But I tell you this, to betray the self in the name of virtue is the greatest sin against the soul. The divine image within you does not ask for annihilation but for wholeness. To live your truth is not to abandon love, but to embody it in its highest form. Authenticity is the deepest prayer. Wholeness is the truest worship. The narcissist will never understand this at first. They will call you selfish. They will call you unloving. But remember, their definitions of love and self were born of emptiness and control. To free yourself is to reject their dictionary. You must write your own, carved not from fear, but from the living symbols of your soul. And when this is done, something miraculous unfolds. The empath who once feared abandonment now discovers a profound inner union. They realize they are never alone, for they walk with the self, the archetype of wholeness, the imago Dei, the living center. This realization does not make life easy, but it makes it meaningful. Suffering is no longer wasted, for it becomes initiation. Love is no longer hunger, for it becomes gift. Solitude is no longer exile, for it becomes communion with the depths. And I say again, this transformation does not belong only to the individual. Each soul who breaks this pattern alters the unconscious of humanity itself. The empath who awakens becomes a living symbol for others. They show that the spell can be broken, that the devourer need not rule, that love need not be bondage. In this way, they become carriers of a new myth, one that whispers to the collective. The day the empath stops pleasing is the day humanity begins to heal. So let us bring this together. The empath, once servant, becomes sovereign. The narcissist, once ruler, is dethroned. But this is not revenge, it is restoration. The order of the psyche is realigned and the self takes its rightful place at the center. The journey is marked by darkness, yes, but also by revelation, by dreams, by synchronicities that confirm you are walking the path of individuation. When you feel the loneliness, remember, it is the silence in which the new self is being born. When you feel the guilt, remember, it is the ghost of the old pattern, not the voice of truth. When you fear you have lost love, remember that what you lost was possession, and what you gain is love in its eternal form. Do not look back, do not bend again, do not pour oil into every lamp. while your own flame dies. You are called to shine, not to be consumed, and when you shine, you become not only free but luminous for others who still wander in the shadow. The day the empath stops pleasing is the day the narcissist loses control forever. But more than this, it is the day the soul remembers itself. It is the day you become whole. It is the day love is reborn, not as hunger but as flame. It is the day the false king falls and the true self rises. It is the day your suffering is transfigured into meaning, your shadow into strength, your solitude into communion. It is, at last, the day of awakening. And so I leave you with this. Cherish the day when your no becomes holy, when your boundaries become sacred, when your soul claims its throne. For in that day, you do not lose love, you find it. You do not abandon the world, you redeem it. You do not betray yourself, you finally come home. And home is where the self has waited all along, eternal, radiant, unbroken,